All right, so a warm welcome everybody online. Everyone's hear me all okay, and welcome everyone in the room. So yes, this is a slightly different setup today because we had a humongous technology fail in our usual rooms over there. It all crashed, all died, and it's all done. It's actually, in some regards, I'm going to look at it as a good thing. So we're actually going to be in this room anyway next month because all this stuff that is all the projectors and all that stuff is kind of old. We've been using it for years, and it did work great. And as we just found out today, it doesn't work so great anymore. So they're going to rip it all out and replace it with much better stuff actually next month. And so our next meeting next month is actually going to be in here anyway because they're in the middle of ripping all that stuff out. So it just died a little early on. So this is a practice run where we figure out if this is going to work for us or not, and that's the way I'm going to choose to look at it. So for those of you who haven't met yet, my name is Adam Hens. I'm the lead of the Houston Azure user group. Been leading this since 2015, I think. And I have a couple of new faces, for example, first time here, and perhaps a few new folks online. So a little bit about this group. This is intended to be sort of a shared community learning experience. It's definitely not meant to be a sales pitch. It's not about being sold anything. That's not what we're about. Because one thing that I've seen in my personal life, I work for Microsoft currently. This is 15 years next month, actually, at Microsoft, and 7 years as a cloud architect, doing nothing but Azure all day, every day.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a fun ride. I've seen a lot of change. I was at the launch of Azure in 2010, where it was a little bit, that's not as good as AWS. That was actually, I was just sat in the audience and I saw it all there. I was like, oh, God. Because I'd had in 2010 an AWS account since 2007. So I was playing with it. This is cool as all get out. And I still have an AWS account, incidentally. So been there at the beginning, helped customers use what that was and has grown over the years. I find it a very, very enjoyable journey. And one of the things that in my professional career we don't get to do that much is sort of have folks who are using it in different industries learn from one another. Right? Professionally, I work one-on-one with individual companies and under NDA, and we have private conversations about what's going on, and that's all good. That's fun. I like doing that. But one thing we don't get the chance to do is let folks learn just from one another. Wow. Because, of course, one thing I'm able to see from my position of working with customers in this way is that the cloud journeys for everyone, even if they're in different industries, we see a lot in Houston, a lot of healthcare, a lot of oil and gas, of course, state and local government, we've had folks, small software companies, large software companies, service providers, lots and lots of actually finance, works in finance companies, seem to have just all of it here in Houston, companies small and large, different business problems, different regulations, if you will, but the IT side of solving those business problems, very, very similar, as it turns out. A lot of the same needs, right, for IT, same software and hardware tools looking to solve them. And so when moving to the cloud, the journeys are very similar, very, very similar. There's some scale differences I've seen. And so there's such an opportunity, I think, for learning from others who have been on this cloud journey, which different paces for different companies, different scales. But this is an opportunity to learn from one another. So we've often had presentations from members of the community. That's been great. Those are some of my favorites. And also colleagues have volunteered to come out and help who have particular deep expertise in a particular area and like talking about it. And that's what we have tonight. My colleague Mitul will talk a little bit more about this group. Pizza tonight is sponsored by Avanade. They have helped us out by feeding us tonight. So, yes, thank you. Thank you, Avanade. Appreciate that. They have a couple of floors down here. We're working very closely. I don't think they were able to send anyone out to represent tonight, but nonetheless, thank you for feeding us. Without further ado, then let us hand over to Mitul, our presenter, who is going to talk about one of my personal favorite solutions in Azure, API management. All right, floor is yours, Mitul.
Cool. Can you do me a favor?
Yeah, what do you need?
I got a bottle of water just in case
Yeah,
I need it.
gotcha.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
That's what friends are for. Get Quentin a bottle of water.
Awesome. All right. Thanks again to Avanag for sponsoring today's dinner. I think everyone is appreciating that right now. So I'll introduce myself a little bit. My name is Mitul Shah. Adam and I are colleagues. We work together on the same team at Microsoft. We're both cloud solution architects. Specifically, we're both what we call app innovation cloud solution architects, really focused on what developers would be interested in doing in Azure. It could be anything in Azure that a developer would be interested in doing. It can be DevOps related. It could be cloud native app development. It could be integration. That actually happens to be my background. I'm a integration architect by experience, I'll say, working with a bunch of customers here in the Houston area and around what we call the South region on APIs, integration, API management, API strategy, all of those topics. That happens to be my area of expertise. I've been at Microsoft about 1.5 years. Prior to Microsoft, I worked in consulting here in the Houston area with oil and gas customers. And prior to that, that was for a long time. But prior to that, worked as a entry-level developer at a natural gas company here in town. So kind of grew up in my career as a developer, and over time have become very interested in integration and APIs and solving those problems. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Azure API management, but I'm going to take a step back from the actual Azure service and just talk about APIs and talk a little bit about API management in general, and then we'll talk about Azure API management, if that makes sense. All right, so what are APIs? What are web APIs specifically? Distilled down into the simplest terms.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is this a little bit informal?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Completely.
What do you want us to be able to walk out the door with? What's the key takeaway?
Sure.
So I know what I'm listening for, if you don't mind mine.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I want you to understand at a high level what an API is, why you might use it, and why you would use something like API management to help you manage those APIs. That's the goal.
Okay.
The demos I have, like Adam mentioned, this is not salesy at all. The demos I have are meant to be fun, or just examples. You'll see some things in there that are kind of interesting or funny. So let's keep it informal. Feel free to stop me if you have questions, if you have a comment. It's nice that we're in this kind of more intimate atmosphere because that helps people feel comfortable.
Good feedback. Yeah. We can be here every month if you want.
All right. So let's talk about web APIs. If I'm going to distill it down, it is a way for one system to interact with another in a repeatable way over the web and specifically over the language of the web, which is HTTP. Does everyone know what HTTP is? Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And does everyone know what an API is? Does everyone know what API stands for?
Advanced Programming Interface.
Application programming.
Application?
Yeah.
Obviously, I qualify as not knowing.
But you got it. So you got it. So application programming interface. So APIs have existed forever, right? If you have an operating system and you need to interact with some device on a laptop, you're going to use an API to interact with that device. Web APIs just take that concept and stretch it across the entire internet. So you can see here, a very high level example of having a web browser, making a request to an API, that API calling something on a web server, that web server calling to a database and returning a response. That's at a high level what we're talking about. So what are some examples of APIs that you might have encountered? If you work in the Microsoft space, you might have heard of the Graph, Microsoft Graph. It is really kind of the corporate directory that your organization or company might use. Outside of Microsoft, let's say you work with Facebook, for example, you might have used the Facebook API, which is the one in the middle. And we're going to talk about API management today. So if you've used Azure, you've definitely used APIs, right? Everything that you do to build out a service in Azure is driven by APIs. And so you have interacted with APIs, you just haven't known it. If you use your phone, if you use Google Maps, if you use any app on your phone, likely there's going to be some API that's backing it. All right, so we talked a lot about APIs. But what actually is an API call? What is that browser that's calling an API? What does that actually look like? We talk a lot about APIs, and you might have heard of something called REST. You'll always hear it as like REST API. Even in this diagram here, you see this REST API. What is REST? Does anybody know what REST stands for?
Representation.
Representative state transition
Protocol.
You can't get enough of
Almost.
it.
It's representational state transfer. That's what it stands for. I said originally that APIs work over HTTP, but that actually doesn't tell you much because HTTP is it's a protocol, right? Really, APIs work in a variety of different ways or different standards. And the ones that you might have heard of, or what is very common in the industry these days, is a REST API. So what is a REST API and how is that different from another type of API? Has anyone heard of a SOAP API?
Yes.
Okay, so a SOAP API works slightly different than a REST API. Essentially, REST is just an agreement among a group or a standards board that says, we're going to do things a certain way. I'm going to use, for example, HTTP verbs, because that is part of HTTP. So you may have heard of get or post. Those are HTTP verbs. I'm going to use a certain URL scheme. I'm going to use a certain type of information or format in the body of the request. And so REST is just a collection of decisions that an industry has made collectively and agreed to use kind of as a standard. So what I have on the left is the request that gets made as part of an API call. So you see post, and then you're posting to some resource, in this case, /API/orders. You're using HTTP and it has a version number 1.1. You're posting that to a host that's api.contoso.com. User agent tells the server what kind of device or client that's being used. The content type is the kind of standard that we're going to use to format our response or format our request and response. And then at the bottom is the actual body. That is it says application JSON. JSON is JavaScript object notation. And the body right there is a JavaScript object notation object. So we're going to do the verb post. We're going to do it to API/orders. We're going to do it to contoso.com. And we're going to post this order, which is for chicken tikka masala, which is a British classic dish. And and then it has ingredients, and I didn't list the ingredients, but that's our order. So presumably, if we're using an API to place an order, we're going to get an order number back. And so the response on the right, first it just confirms the HTTP version and that we're using HTTP. The next thing you have is a response code. In this case, 202, which is the accepted response. And basically that's the server saying, yes, I got your request and I accepted your request. This is just giving a little bit of status information that the connection to the server has been closed. It gives a date. It affirms a content type. It also talks about, well, sorry, this is a little slightly off, but it affirms a content type. It tells me what the server is, and then I get an order ID back. So I've made an API call using an HTTP request, post request, and I've gotten a response. This is the essence of a REST call. And so if you look at what requests a browser is making on your behalf, they all look very similar to this. There'll be gets, there'll be posts, there'll be puts, there'll be patches. We'll talk about all of the different verbs now. So HTTP verbs, in REST, the verb actually signifies what you're trying to do or the type of operation that's occurring. So gets are perfect for obtaining information. That could be for a list of things, that could be for an individual thing. Get is what you would use to describe an operation where you're getting information. Post is when I want to create something. So I wanted to create an order in the last example. I'm going to post that order. Put and patch and post, they can get a little bit confusing. I'll try to explain the difference between them. Usually you will pick a certain methodology and follow that methodology. I'll say the industry is a little bit split on put and patch and post. Post is pretty well set. Put and patch are interesting. So when I post something, I create a new resource, I create a new item. But when I put something, I'm updating an existing item. I'm updating it fully. I'm basically replacing what was originally there with a brand new version of that thing. So I know that's a little confusing, but bear with me for a second. Delete's obvious. You're deleting something. Patch is when you, instead of, so very similar to put, but instead of fully replacing something, I'm just updating a small portion of it. Right? So I could use put and patch. I could use post. Depending on the API, you can decide which ones you want to adopt as part of your API. Any questions so far? That's good. Cool. So I just have like maybe 10 slides. Then we're gonna jump into demo. I'm not gonna slide you to death. All right. So we've kind of established what APIs are. But why do I need to manage APIs? What am I going to accomplish by, we're talking about API management today. Why is that even important to me? Well, I'm going to skip forward one slide so you can kind of see what API management will help you do, and then we'll go back and talk about how it helps you. But think about it this way. I've got a bunch of clients. It could be a browser, it could be a mobile phone, it could be an app that I wrote for my desktop. It could be any of those things, right? I have a bunch of clients and I have a bunch of APIs. Let's say that my clients need to talk to API 1, 2, and 3. And then the other client needs to also talk to API 1, 2, and 3. You can see there's 6 lines between clients and APIs. What API management does for you is it puts something in the middle. So there's clients that call API management, so it's very simple on the front end, and API management that calls out to our different APIs, and it's very simple on the back end. There's nothing crisscrossing. The other really good thing is, what API management is super useful for is it allows us to do things like abstract information. So let's say I have two APIs that I need to call to create one, one thing that I'm interested in creating. An API management solution allows me to make two calls separately and group those things back together. Or opposite, if I need to get information from two different sources, maybe I make one call and get information from two different sources. I may be dealing with really old APIs. A SOAP API is a great example of something that's pretty, that's about 15 years or 20 years that it's, SOAP has been out in the world, and a lot of old APIs that you may want to modernize using an API management solution. The other thing you might want to do is you might want to define an API, a set of APIs, but you don't have time to build the backend yet. So you want to decouple the development process. You want to set up a definition of an API and then build the backend later. So maybe that's one way that you want to use an API management solution. That covers kind of the abstraction piece. The other thing we might want to do is control those APIs. So first thing that most developers might want to do is secure their APIs. Like, I want to make sure that a user that's calling my API is allowed to call that API, or an application that is calling my API isn't calling my API too often. And so we might want to put those kinds of controls in place to make sure that our APIs are being used in the way that we want them to be used. The other thing that I might want to do is I might want to take data that I got from this system, and maybe I want to transform that data in some way. Maybe I want to change a value, or maybe I want to change the format from something like XML to JSON that we talked about. And then lastly, maybe I want to.
Control and a question, right?
Yeah.
Does it do the OAuth authentication as well?
Yes.
Okay.
So so we haven't talked about Azure API management.
Okay, gotcha.
Azure API management does do OAuth, but
Could you repeat his question when you get one?
yeah, sure. So he's asking whether it does OAuth.
What's OAuth?
So OAuth is a modern API-based authentication mechanism. So in previous or in older solutions or legacy solutions, you might have heard of NTLM or Kerberos or SAML. Those are all authentication mechanisms. OAuth is also an authentication. Yep. Okay. And the last thing that I might be interested in as a developer, if I build an API, maybe I want to publicize that I built that API. Maybe I want other people to use my API. So how do we support documenting the API? How do we support other folks in our organization or other developers using those APIs? That's an important part of an API management solution. So those are, these at a very high level, the reasons why you might want to manage your APIs. And again, you want to reduce the amount of spaghetti lines that are between all your various systems. Think about it this way. If I'm building authentication and I have two clients and I'm connecting to 3 different APIs, I'm going to build authentication for each one of those lines that I've drawn there. Whereas in the after solution, I built the authentication once at that API management layer, and all my APIs and all my clients use it the same way, right? So it takes that that repetitiveness and that redundancy that you would have with all those lines crisscrossing, it makes it simpler. Okay.
Does it do load balancing?
API management?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. So let's talk about that, because load balancing can happen on the front end or the back end. So let's talk about where, but we'll talk about it in just a second.
Or
So I'm going to describe now Azure API management. So I've been talking generally about why I might want to manage APIs, but really we have a solution for you in this space. And so we're going to talk about Azure API management and how it fits into all those categories that I just described, right? So we think about Azure API management in terms of 3 different kind of solution areas, right? One is that publicizing to developers, right? Allowing developers to onboard to our APIs, learn about our APIs, look at our documentation. And that really is the developer portal piece of Azure API management, this square here. When I describe Azure API management, I describe it as 3 planes: a user plane, a management plane, and a data plane. In this case, the developer portal is the user plane. That's what users interact with, okay? So I will demo the developer portal. You'll see it. We'll talk about what it can do for you and how it works. So we'll spend a little time on that. So that's one solution area within Azure API management. The other solution area is, okay, I've got a bunch of APIs in a developer portal. Those had to come from somewhere, right? Someone had to publish them. Someone had to put governance in place for them. And that really is the management plane. For Azure API management, the management plane is the Azure portal. So if you ever used Azure, you go to the Azure portal, you pull up API management, that's where you do a lot of these activities. You can also do them through things like CI/CD. You can also do them through a REST API or a CLI command. So you have all those capabilities of managing APIs using all the tools that you're used to with Azure. That's the management plane. And then the last thing is the gateway plane or the data plane. And the gateway is the thing that does the work, right? It's the thing that makes the networking requests. It's the thing that enforces your governance. It's the thing that does the OAuth authentication, right? That is the component that does all the work. The gateway is super important. It's also the thing that you don't see. You don't see the gateway. It just is there, right? You are making calls to it. It's doing all this work, but you don't like interact with the gateway necessarily. So you've got app developers. That's one audience. They're trying to discover, learn, onboard, understand your APIs. You've got API providers. They're the developers that are building APIs and publishing APIs, documenting those APIs. And at the end of the day, they're going to operate those APIs, look at, they're going to want to maintain those APIs. That's the kind of API providers group. And then you have a whole bunch of people that are going to actually use the APIs. So that's, apps. It could be actual employees, partners, customers, devices. There's all sorts of consumers of those APIs. Oh, and by the way, this is an Azure service. And so there's all sorts of integrations built into Azure API management. You can integrate with networking capabilities like Azure Front Door and Azure App Gateway. Those are kind of load balancing and gateway type components. You can integrate with some of the other integration components like Service Bus or Event Grid. You can integrate with App Insights to get telemetry and logging information. And then you have first-class support of things like DevOps. You have a plugin for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code to work with API management. So you get a lot of the Microsoft Azure stuff when you use something like API management. The other thing you can do is your APIs, you can actually pull them in from Azure resources. I will demo that in our demo. But I can go and select an Azure function that responds to an HTTP request and pull that into my API management environment. So you have that kind of first-class integration with Azure resources. Any questions at a high level about API management? We'll talk about some of the features next. To your question about load balancing, depending on how you set up your environment, you will get load balancing on the front end. So if someone is calling an API, they're going to call the gateway component, right? Depending on how you have yours set up, you would get load balancing on the front end. And then if you need load balancing on the back end, we have ways of solving for that problem as well. So, depending on where your APIs are, whether it's in And if it's a microservice and it's sitting in Kubernetes, you might solve that load balancing problem one way. If it's in a set of VMs, you might solve it a different way. So we leverage Azure as much as possible for those solutions. So it could be an Azure load balancer if it's VMs. It could be an ingress controller if it's in Kubernetes. It just kind of depends on the situation.
And it does load balance across regions.
Correct.
How does that work with reverse proxy?
So depending on the reverse proxy solution you select, we would typically recommend something like an app gateway. You can set up your app gateway. Each one of the, so let's say we have 2 regions. Each one of the regions has its own API gateway, and you would reverse proxy to the API gateways themselves.
So there's no way, is there a solution on the backside of the gateway
Sorry, Siri.
to do that? To treat have the Azure.
Can you repeat the
API?
question, sorry?
Can you use the Azure API management itself as the reverse proxy? So that you load your certificates to it and then
You can, so yes, you can. So it by nature, it is roughly a reverse proxy. Depending on what you want to do, yes, you can load your certificates into it. You can do mutual TLS to your backends. You can, there's a whole bunch of capabilities. Depending on what you want to do, there's quite a bit you can do.
A demo would help at all.
What's that?
A demo would help.
A demo would help.
Yeah,
Okay, I have one more slide and then we'll jump into the demo.
nice.
I don't have a demo, unfortunately, I don't have a demo on multi-region. It's very expensive. And I am running out of budget in my own Azure account for a multi-region environment. Anyway, it doesn't demo that well because you just see that there's 2 locations. That's all you see. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about all the various features. There's tons and tons of features within Azure API management. But the idea behind this slide is that there is a life cycle to developing an API. And Azure API management has features at every step of that life cycle. So as I'm going to design my API, we'll walk through like probably roughly 1 feature on each one of these bubbles. But we'll talk about how I might design an API, how I might develop that API, how I might govern that API, how I might secure that API. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on security because it's not a compelling demo. Just suffice to say that we have a lot of capabilities around security. How I might publish my API. We probably also won't talk a lot about scale, but we won't demo it, but we can talk about it. I'm happy to talk about, get as deep as we want to on things like scale. We'll spend a little time talking about monitoring and analyzing. But really, I want you to get a feel for what it is like to work with API management, what kinds of things you can do, and hopefully this is an interesting demo. It's hopefully not too businessy. I try to make it a little bit fun. All right, so quickly jumping into the demo. We'll do a quick overview of API management. I'll walk you through provisioning one. It takes about 45 minutes, so we're not going to actually provision one. We'll publish an API or actually several APIs. We'll apply policy, so we'll look at the policy framework. We'll show you what the experience is for developers and how to build out that experience. And we'll talk about some other cool features. Sound good to everyone?
Yes.
Any questions before we move forward? Okay. So I have a little cheat sheet here. You don't pay that in mind. All right. Is everyone able to see my screen? I don't see the chat, so someone.
I'm watching the chat. That is too small, Mitul. I can't see that. Can I make that
We just turn the lights off.
Control plus.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Or, you know,
That's
much better.
how's that? That's a little too dark.
Little bit.
Fine. That's
Yeah, bigger font
dim as
would
it
work.
goes. How about that?
Okay.
Bigger font may work, I guess.
That's a little better.
Try Control Plus.
Okay.
Yeah, I just don't want to zoom too much because I know it's busy. There's a lot of features, so it's busy for a reason. If I zoom too much, you'll actually start, especially as we get to parts of the demo, you'll start to not see things, unfortunately. So hopefully this is good. It will be a little better when I move away from the screen. There's just a lot of text on the screen.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start creating a new API management. I'm not gonna finish creating it, but we'll start creating it. So I'm gonna search in my Azure portal for API management services and create. So I'm gonna create an API management. It's just like any other Azure resource. So it gets deployed to a resource group. We pick a region. I'm gonna pick East US. I give it a name, demo. HOU demo 2. I give it an organization name and an administrator email. You get an email after it's done provisioning. So that's what they need your email for. Then I select a tier. So there's a bunch of tiers here. Almost any enterprise customer is going to use 2 of those, which is developer and premium. A lot of the enterprise specific features that people are looking for, like multi-region, those are only available in the premium tier. If you're just a developer and you're looking to try out API management, developer is great because it's cheap. It has no SLA, but it is inexpensive. Alternately, you can use the consumption SKU. That is essentially free for a certain number of API calls. So cool. Very inexpensive. It doesn't have all the features that the rest of the tiers have. There's certain features like GraphQL that I'm going to show you later that are not available on the consumption tier. So just be aware. There we have a chart that describes what all the tiers are. From an enterprise perspective, developer and premium is what we typically will see. Okay, so I'm going to just select developer. Then I can do things like turn on application insights integration. I can tell, so if I had selected premium, for example, I can tell it how many units. So if I want multiple units or multiple scale, I can scale the environment here. I can tell it to use a managed identity. I don't know how much folks are familiar with managed identities.
I don't know what a managed identity is.
Okay, so managed identity is essentially a service account that's created as part of the creation of this resource in Azure. The great part of that is that service account doesn't have a password. So you don't have to maintain a password. Azure essentially allows you to call other Azure services using that managed identity without having to go and maintain a password. If I delete this API management instance, that managed identity goes away. So it is tied to the life cycle of this particular resource. The other thing I can do is there's a lot of networking. So I will say this sounds like a developer topic. API management is a very infrastructure heavy solution. So I myself, being a developer, have had to learn a lot about networking and load balancing and all of those things as part of working with an API management solution. So you have options to turn on different networking aspects and make your instance more or less private, depending on what your needs are. You also have the ability to turn on or off specific protocol settings. One that you might be interested in is, okay, there's TLS1, which has been pretty much deprecated. You don't want to use it. SSL3, you don't want to use it because it has vulnerability. So we make you say specifically that you need it before we turn it on, things like that. So lastly, you can set some tags and then you click create if you want to create it. I'm not going to do that because it takes some time and I already have one. I'm going to go back to my demo instance, which is here. All right, so this is the kind of overview blade of API management. It gives you just at a glance a lot of information about my environment. So you can see here, this is the developer tier. Yeah, I did not set up a virtual network. And by default, I'm using a domain that Microsoft gave me, which is azure-api.net. I have a link to my developer portal that will be interesting to look at. But this just gives you some high-level information. Also gives you a little bit of detail about what's happening in the environment right now. So how many requests am I getting? What kind of errors am I seeing? How long are my requests taking? At a glance, I get some information about my environment. So you can see already that we, build in a lot of the capabilities that you might be interested in, like things like monitoring. And lastly, you'll see here, this is an Azure resource. And so rights and authorization to it are managed just like any other Azure resource using Azure role-based access control. So I can assign developers to have a certain role. I can assign administrators to have a different role. I can control this just like I would any other Azure resource. And API management itself has several roles that come out of the box. All right, at a high level, that is the API management interface, but really the interesting thing here is APIs. So we're going to jump into this APIs screen. So I'm going to click on APIs, and you'll see a set of APIs here. I have some in here already. And if you spin up an instance of it, Azure API Management, you will get this Echo API by default. It comes out of the box. It is just an example that you can play with. I've also added some other interesting ones. I've got a Pokemon one, and I've got a demo conference API. We're talking about Ignite starting tomorrow. We have a little bit of a conference API that we can leverage, right? So if I'm defining a new API, let's say I have one that I've built, it's running on a VM somewhere, I can access it using a particular URL, and I want to publish that to my API management environment. The easiest way to publish an API into my API management environment is to manually define an HTTP API. So let's call this Contoso API. Let's say the URL is api.contoso.com, and I'm going to go to API/API/v1 as just a convention that I'm going to use. It is an HTTPS API. I can do things like define a description. I'm not going to do that at this point. I can tell it that it's HTTP or HTTPS. And then I can do things like assign products. We'll talk about products a little bit later, but I'm going to go ahead and assign some products. So I've created an API. Right now, it's very much a skeleton API, right? I have nothing in there. Can't really do, whoops. There we go. Forgot the HTTPS. Okay, so I've got a skeleton API. It's just a container right now. I don't actually have any operations in my API. So let's add an operation. Since this, I'm essentially publishing this API from scratch, right? I'm going to call this the catch-all API. And this catch-all API is basically going to respond to any GET request that I post. It's called a wildcard /star, anything. If I do a GET and I pass in any URL, API management is going to send a request to my backend, right? So at a high level, if I want to publish an API in the easiest way possible or the least amount of steps, this is how I do it. Now, is this useful? Not really. Remember, we talked about
If you already have the API you want to use existing someplace, you could do that.
you could do that, and that's why you would do that.
You would have to have the API existing someplace.
Yes, you would have to. Yeah,
That's-
you can't really do much
Yeah.
with just this. You need the API to exist somewhere for this to work at all. What I want to say though is that, like, okay, I've done this, but what value is this adding? Not really anything. I'm basically responding at the API gateway and sending a request to my backend. I'm doing nothing. I've also not documented this in any way. So any user that's using this API developer, they have no idea how this API works. They don't know what they can get, what kinds of resources they can get from my API, because all they see here is this /star. So I can do a get on anything. That's not useful. So maybe we start to build this out a little bit further, right? Maybe I'm going to change up this this request a little bit. Maybe I'm going to call this get tests, right? And we're going to respond not to star, but like get tests, right? Now we've got like an actual resource that we're going to use. And maybe let's put a description this time, right? Gets a list of tests from our API. And let's say we want to define a response, right? Like we expect if this is a successful request, that we're going to get a 200 OK, which is the HTTP response. And then let's describe it. This request succeeded. And returns a, can't type today, the list of tests, right? So I'm putting more documentation, right? The other thing I want to do is like, I want to add an example. I'm going to add an example response, right? So let's say my response looks like, name test one or something like that. This is just an example. All right, so I've gone through, I've added some more information. Now a developer can call my get tests and get a list of tests, and they can really see that, that this is, I've named it properly, I've given some descriptions, I'm building out essentially a design for my API. And so if I come in here where I just was building this out, you can see something called the Open API Specification View. So I'm going to open that. What is that? You can see here a file that gets generated that has my documentation that I put in, right? And I built that in API management. It's not the most efficient way to do it, right? I could open this up in Visual Studio Code and write a bunch of JSON, and I could have the same thing, and I didn't have to click in 10 different places in API management to do that. So at the end of the day, does it really make sense for me to do all of that when I could just build one of those specs? Maybe not. Maybe I want to build a spec. So API management actually solves for that problem, which is that I can now, instead of adding a manually defined API, I can actually import an API using an Open API spec. So real quick, we'll talk about Open API specs. You may have heard this termed as Swagger, a Swagger document. Open API spec, Swagger, those are synonymous. An Open API spec basically defines the operations, it defines the responses, it defines your documentation. It is your documentation. And so, sorry, one sec. It is your documentation. And so Azure API management actually allows you, instead of doing this manually, to actually import an Open API spec. So I'm going to go to my cheat sheet here and grab a URL that I need to pull in. So I have a API that's based on an Open API spec, and I'm going to go ahead and just paste in a URL to that specification. And you'll see that automatically it pulls in the name, it pulls in some information. I'm going to give it a URL suffix. So I'm going to say calc, right? So when I hit that environment, when I hit this API, I'm going to hit /calc, and then I get all the operations. And so I'm going to go ahead and click full here, and I'm going to assign a couple of products. Well, I'll show you why this is important later. I'm going to just do it. See, this one already has a description because it was defined in the specification. So pretty easy. I selected a specification. Now you see my basic calculator API. I have a bunch of operations already. They got imported as part of my API. And what's cool is I can actually go and test this now. So I imported my API. I'm gonna call this add two integers API with 51 and 49. I will give it a product just to make sure that that works. And I'm gonna go ahead and hit send. And that you can see in my API, I got a result of value 100 because it added 51 and 49, right? So much easier, right? Much easier to import an open API spec that has all my documentation built in already. And what's cool is I have uploaded this open API spec, and actually I have what's called a developer portal that pulls in all of this information for me. I'm going to do one thing that I restarted my machine right before this meeting started, and I meant to open this in an in-private window. I'll explain why I do it in an in-private window. So if I come in here to my APIs, what you will see there, now I have basic calculator. If I click on basic calculator, I have all of my documentation built into this developer portal. So add two integers, I can see what request parameters are.
Could you make that just a little bigger?
Yeah, sorry.
There it is.
So I have my basic calculator. I have, that description that we added, produces a sum of two numbers. I get what the request looks like, get what my request parameters are. Oh, and by the way, I also have a way of trying this within the developer portal. So same test that I did in the other portal, I can do that here as well. I will do this later because I need to log in, but I'll come back to this. I just wanted to show that I added that spec, I added that API, it shows up in the developer portal immediately.
So the developer portal, is that something you created?
No,
Oh, that's created.
that comes with part of the service.
Oh.
What I did, and we'll talk about this later, is I put this branding on it. I made it green. I made it look like my slide deck, things like that, right? I put branding on it. Okay, so I've added my basic calculator, super easy. I've tested that, super easy. All right, so I've added one API. Let's add another API. This one I'm gonna pull from a function app. I've already got a function app, and because this is all integrated in Azure, I can click browse here, and what it's gonna do is gonna pull up the functions that I have access to, right? So I'm gonna click select, and I'm gonna select a particular function app. In this case, it's the Houston Azure demo. And this function is very basic. I did not make it anything fancy. But you can see my demo API, got a get and a post, and the URL template is my demo API. I'm gonna go ahead and select that one and import it. So I got a display name. I'll make this a little bit easier to read. Function demo. We'll give it a URL suffix of func. We'll go ahead and add it. So the reason why I'm adding products is that's how it shows up in the developer portal. So that's why I'm adding these products. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and click create. We're gonna go ahead and test this out here in a second as well. But it's that easy. I have a function. That function is based on an HTTP trigger. I'm able to find it through API management and pull it into my environment. All right, so I'm gonna do this get my demo API. I'll just quickly test. This one requires a parameter of name. And I'm gonna pass it my name. Go ahead and hit send. And it gives me a response. I love the tool. So I've got my function running. It responded with this because I passed in my name. Pretty easy. Cool. All right, so let's add some more APIs. We're going to spend a lot of time today adding APIs, but I'll show different features each time, hopefully. All right, the next one we're gonna do is, okay, I've got a bunch of APIs published. How do I use those APIs? And we'll show an interesting way of using those APIs. So the first thing I'm gonna do is go to my cheat sheet here and grab a URL that I need. Because I'm going to
define
add,
all this stuff in Visual Studio.
what's that?
I define all this stuff in Visual Studio and not use a web interface.
Yes, you can. So all of this can be deployed using ARM templates. There's a Visual Studio plugin that you can use. So you don't have to do this through the web interface. It just demos better if I do it through the web interface. Okay, I'm gonna add another API. I'm gonna import a spec again. I'm gonna add this one, which is the Mark Harrison Colors API. And I'm gonna give it a suffix of colors. And again, I'm gonna go and make sure my products are selected. And import this API. Same thing like the calculator API, this colors API is gonna go and create all of my different API operations. This one actually has a little bit more documentation with responses and definitions. So I'm gonna just quickly test this get random color API. If I hit send here, I get the color pink, which is a random color, which is exactly what my API does. That's great. I built the API, I'm using the API, or I've made available the API, but I want to use the API. I'm interested in using it. So I have this website here, and I am going to update this website with my cheat sheet real quick. And what this website's going to do is it's going to call my API, and it's going to essentially fill in colors on this little grid. Okay. The first thing I'm going to do, if I come back to my API here, you can see that it does a get for this colors random, right? So if I go back to my site here, I have it already set up to do colors random. But if I do this, I'm going to get an error. Why am I getting an error? Well, you'll remember that when I called this API, I set up a product that it applies to. When I call it from the portal, API management knows that I'm an administrator. I can call any API I want. So it doesn't ask me for a product key. When I call from somewhere else, like this website, I need a product key, and I'm missing a product key. So I need to add my product key. And luckily, I copied it from my little cheat sheet. I'm gonna add my product key here. Don't worry, I will rotate this key later. So if you write it down, you're not gonna get anywhere. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and hit start. And what it's gonna do is gonna fill out dots. But you'll notice after 5, it stopped. And the reason it stopped is this product has a policy on it that says you can only call 5 times in a certain amount of time, right? So if I reset,
The policy is defined by API management.
it's by API management. Yeah. So if I try to keep doing this, it's not going to work because I've called 5 times. If I wait a certain amount of time, I think about 30 seconds, and reset again, it will work again. That's cool. You can give it a second. It's gonna take some time. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I just so happen to have another subscription that lets me do more than that, right? It lets me call as many times as I want to call. I'm going to update this with my other API with the key. It has a key also, and I'm going to go ahead and submit. It's a different key. I'm going to go ahead and hit start. And now it's going to fill out, right? It can call more than 5 times. That's because I gave it a key that allows me to do that. So this is going to fill out this whole diagram with different colors, and it's calling get random, right? It's getting a random color and filling it in on the page. This is cool.
Does it check to see when it calls get random? If the position, is the position also random? Or, because
Well, you
it's
can
not
see
doing it
being
in order.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So does it check to see if that position's already been used
No,
before
you
it puts a
can see
color
the
there, or
colors
does it
changing.
recolor?
Yeah, no,
Watch it.
it's so it's not doing anything too tricky, right? It just gets a color and fills it in a random place. You will see the colors kind of replace themselves over
Okay.
time. That's why some of these aren't filling in. All right, so based on my deck and based on the developer portal, you can tell I like green. I don't there's a lot of blue on this. I don't necessarily like blue, so let's change that, right? Let's change that a little bit. What we're gonna do is we're actually going to do something called a transformation policy. We're gonna use a transformation policy. And before we do that, what's interesting is that I've got a bunch of different color APIs here, right? Get random is one of them, but I've got like 10 of them. And maybe I don't want to make this transformation happen just for one API. Maybe I want to reuse that transformation across more than one of these APIs. I'm going to use something called a policy fragment. That policy fragment is a way for me to define a reusable policy that I can use across multiple APIs. So we're going to go quickly look at what that looks like. What that policy looks like here is it's going to find and replace, anytime it sees blue, it's going to replace it with green, because I like green, right? And so in a response, it's going to go and replace it with green. And I've got this policy fragment. I can use this policy fragment. So what does that actually look like? I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go back to my APIs. I'm going to go to get random color. I'm going to apply a policy. I'm going to apply it here in the outbound section. But I'm going to use that fragment. So if you saw the fragment said find and replace, what I'm going to say is include fragment, color change color policy, right? I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And then if I come back to my colors, I'm going to reset this. You should see that mostly the things that were blue are getting replaced with green. So there's a lot more green on this now than there was before. Some of these colors don't have the word blue, even though they show up blue. And so some of these are
Azure.
yeah. If it said Azure, it's not going to replace it because it's
Or Navy.
It's a very simple policy. But you can see that there's a lot more green happening now, right? So one way to use policies.
Yours do what you tell them to, not what you want them to.
Yes, sometimes they do, yes. Pretty cool. Okay.
Yeah, except I don't see many reds, so this must be a liberal program.
He doesn't like red.
Just joking.
All right, so that's a way to use an API. I didn't want to build a whole bunch of custom apps to kind of demonstrate that, but kind of a cool way to demonstrate, a visual way to demonstrate it.
Any questions at this point? We've got one online, Mitul.
What's the question online?
So Alex, I think I didn't want to interrupt, I was waiting for him. So you were showing, he asked why is the suffix URL required? You had it up earlier.
Yeah, so it's just a good practice. And the reason why it's a good practice is that there may be situations where you have the exact same operation in two different APIs. So, you may have a slash get. You may have a get tests. You might have tests in two different APIs. And so a really easy way and a good practice when you're using API management is to put that suffix in place so that you differentiate the two different APIs. I've got, slash demo slash tests, and I've got slash colors slash tests. So just a way to differentiate the two APIs, good practice.
And when you imported from that function app, was that an anonymous function, or how did it automatically set up the
It uses a
authentication?
function key.
Oh, it automatically gets that key when you
Yeah.
import it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it actually gets the key, and it puts it in a named values store. So it actually doesn't put the key in the API definition, it puts it in a named value store so that you can reference it. You can actually move it from here to like something like Azure Key Vault if you wanted to.
So what's the function key?
So he was asking about function authentication. And so you can authenticate to a function in a bunch of different ways, but a very common way to authenticate to APIs is to use some sort of key. So I showed you subscription keys for my APIs, but functions are very similar. And so you can use a function key to authenticate to a function. When I imported the function, it automatically imported the key for me, and it saved it in this named value store. And then I can reference that key in the definition of the API itself. It actually takes care of all that for you. You don't have to do it manually,
Quick question,
but it will actually pull in the key.
quick question.
Yeah.
Can you do a JSON transformation as a like totally different JSON object?
Yes,
You do, okay.
yes. So actually, we're about to do some transformational stuff now.
Segue. Great question.
Great, yeah, great segue. All right, so we talked about SOAP. You know, SOAP is an older protocol, yes, but in a lot of organizations, that's something you got to deal with because there are older systems that you want to interface with, and maybe there's ways for you to modernize. You know, I'm doing modernize in quotes, but really give yourself a REST interface on top of a SOAP service. So first thing we're going to do is import just a SOAP service.
One more question.
Yeah.
Let's say you have a legacy something, like say WCF endpoints or
Yep.
say remoting endpoints, very old maybe,
Very,
Like-
yeah.
like 15 years old. You can do that. You can add.
Yeah, so
the
there's
backend.
not any real good ways to like import something for that, but if you do a raw HTTP API, you can build out a definition that will allow you to call that API.
Yeah.
With some of those legacy things, you may not get the best experience doing it this way, but at least you have some capability. Like I mentioned before, you know, you would only use this as like manual approach if you have very specific needs.
Remoting is totally old. Like,
Yeah,
But WCF, some of that supports WSDL, right? Back in the
exactly.
day.
Yeah.
Which is actually what he's demonstrating.
Yeah,
So,
Azure.
so if you've made it as far back as HTTP, then you're okay. Anything binary, not so much.
Yeah.
You're talking about .NET remoting, right?
Yeah, .NET
right.
remoting
Yeah,
or,
why are
or
you
maybe.
doing .NET remoting in 2022?
Legacy.
I mean,
Legacy.
that
Somebody
predates
has a.
WCF.
Yeah.
But it's
I'm
out
just-
there though, is his point. though,
It's
right?
already out there.
It's
Like
still
nobody
out
wants
there.
Is it
to.
even supported past like 2.0?
Yeah, no, I'm
It's even
saying,
supported prior.
I'm saying
supported
it-
after
that's why I
2.0.
said legacy. Like
Yeah.
somebody
And-
still.
and
You
Everything
gotta get-
has
you gotta
it.
get off the
Nobody
.NET
touches it.
1.0
Nobody
stuff.
We all violently agree with you. We all recognize that it's.
I mean, Microsoft
Yeah,
doesn't
we-
like WCF, so, you know, they
Yeah.
hate that stuff. I'm just kidding, we have ASP,
Yeah.
classic ASP at our,
Yeah, see, there you go.
that should be, we have a
It's out there.
mainframe.
Oh, yeah, you could be using totally not HTTP, but
Yeah,
TCP,
something
dot-
really.
NetTCP.
Yeah,
There's so
Absolutely.
many of them.
yeah, there definitely is.
What about gRPC?
Not supported today.
Plans,
Can't. I don't know.
roadmap?
I don't know. There's been
Then
debate.
the next question is SignalR, of course.
So WebSockets is supported.
Okay.
Specifically SignalR, there's no like out of the box support, but general WebSockets are supported.
That's gotta be
Yeah.
on the.
Yeah, the good
roadmap.
answer
It's
is,
gotta be on the roadmap.
I think it is on the roadmap, but I don't know.
With an
all-
event hub, that would be like, throw it out.
All right, I'm gonna do a quick import of a WSDL. So I'm gonna pull in a SOAP service. We'll call it number conversion. We'll give it a suffix of number. SOAP. I have an option here: SOAP pass through or SOAP to rest. I'm going to keep this as a pass through just to demonstrate it. SOAP to rest is way more interesting. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and create this, and we're going to quickly test it, and then we're going to do the more interesting thing, which is convert it. So this API converts a number to word or a number to dollars. We'll just quickly test this API. And instead of using this request body because it's badly formatted, it's not a problem with API management, it's a problem with that WSDL. I have my own. I'm going to go ahead and I just imported a text file that has a SOAP request in it. I'm going to go ahead and send that. And it does, it had 20 and it converts that to $20. Got it? Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add another same API, but I'm going to do a SOAP conversion this time. Okay. So SOAP to REST conversion, we'll call it number conversion REST this time. We'll call it number REST. We're going to go ahead and create that. Now, API management in the background is doing all sorts of stuff for you here. First of all, if I look at one of these requests, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff in here. You'll see a bunch of policies. So it is rewriting the URI to be more RESTful. It's setting a body. It's setting a header. It has a bunch of logic in here that is built. And it's doing it's doing some translations as part of this as well. So it's done a lot of the work for you to do. Actually, you could do this yourself, but it's done the work for you. So I'm going to do that same test. We'll actually look at what it does. So you'll see now that it's not an XML request like a SOAP request would normally have. It's a JSON request. I'll say 20, and it's going to do number to dollars again. And now I get a SOAP, and a JSON response. Number to dollars response, result is $20. So I had a JSON from a SOAP. I've modernized my SOAP API to use JSON and REST just like I would build a new API. I didn't have to do anything except click one button, right? So that's pretty nice and kind of a key feature for a lot of organizations that look at something like API management, right? Okay. So we published a whole bunch of APIs, right? We published a bunch of APIs, and and as part of publishing those APIs, we've got a lot of documentation that's now available. I'm gonna have to open this again because it expired my logout or my login. If I open the API management portal in this way, it will give me an editing interface, and that is what I used to apply branding to this portal. So I made this font green and I uploaded this picture and I put this gradient in place and I changed the font. So I've given this a special look and feel for this particular demo, right? And so I can keep doing that, right? Maybe I don't like that this font is white and maybe I want to go change that. So how do I do that? I'm going to go to my styles page here. And that's actually a menu up at the top. And so I have the ability to edit menus. So I'm going to click on this menu. I'm going to edit the style and I'm going to edit the default style. And this says the text is white. I don't like white. Maybe light gray is a better color. Let me choose the light gray. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to save my changes. Let's go preview what those changes might look like. Oh, that's actually way worse. So that actually doesn't look all that good at all. So maybe I want to go back. So I made the change. It's gray now, but I can't read it. So I'll come back here and I will click on this again and I'll edit my style again. And this default, I'm going to change the color. I'm going to make it white again. Done the wrong place. Make that white again. I'm going to hit save. So you get a really nice, as a controller or as an administrator of API management, you get a really nice interface for managing your API management, developer portal, branding it, and you can see it's back to white. So I change it to gray, I change it to white, I can save. And okay, I've made these changes. I can actually go and publish those changes here too. I can click this button.
Quick question.
It will go through a process of publishing. Yeah.
how is it determining if you have permissions to actually make those changes? Is that using the same Azure RBAC that lets you do the other stuff you were doing?
Yeah, so when I log in using this link here, it will actually single sign me in to that developer portal. That's why I actually pulled up that developer portal in an in-private window, because it knows I'm logged into this machine and it will automatically do all that for me. If I go to my other screen here, whoops, that's not what I wanted. Where is the other browser?
And connected to his question, how would you lock this down if you wanted different groups to have access to only a part of it? Let's say your organization has all these different teams. You wanted to implement API management, but you only wanted to give control. How granular can you get with that?
Good question. I will have a better answer in some period of time. Right now, CI/CD is the best way to do it. There's still possibilities of kind of teams writing over themselves. You can do some things with RBAC, but it's not the most ideal solution. We're working on it, is what I can tell you. Okay, so now this is the like unauthenticated view, right? So this is like the view that I would see if I'm not logged in. By adding all those products at the beginning, it automatically shows my APIs here. If I did not do that, they wouldn't show up here. So I did that on purpose so they would show up here. If I don't do that though, if I'm gonna log in to this account, to this developer portal. Using an account that I created before. And this is the authenticated view. So now you see that I have a profile. This is my profile. It has some information about my account that I use, my first name, last name, and it has information about subscriptions, which is an interesting thing. So let's talk about that a little bit. So we talked about products, and I showed you that there were a couple products that I added to my system, Starter and Unlimited. Starter was the one that was a little bit, that was throttled, right? It only showed 5 lights. Unlimited showed all the lights. And so I can define as an API management administrator the number of products I want for my developer portal. And as a user of that developer portal, what I can do is then request access to a specific product. So you can see here that I don't have a subscription to the Starter product. Maybe I want one. So I'm going to call it, I'm going to say Mitul's Starter subscription. You can see what APIs are part of that product here at the bottom. And I can click subscribe. What that's going to do is generate one of those keys for me. So you can see a couple of keys here that I could leverage. I can regenerate those keys if I want to. So as a developer, I have, I can come in here, look at the APIs that are available to me. I can look at the documentation for those APIs. Arithmetics is just a call away. I can try those APIs. And now I can try those APIs with a key, right? So you can see automatically that when I subscribe, now it pulls my keys in. And I can try that same exact thing that I did in the other portal. I can try it here. Actually, I can't because it.
Minimize that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. So it's saying that I can't because I turned off cores. So I'm going to go quickly fix that. I'm going to fix it in a way that none of you should fix it. And that is by putting star. That basically allows any origin.
Security by obscurity.
Oh, sorry. It's all a hack. I'm just trying to get it to work for the demo.
I can see you've done that before.
Indeed, I have done that before. It does not seem to like.
Remind me not to speak to my protocol.
Does not seem to like when I want to go to my other windows for whatever reason. So I'm gonna minimize.
Cool.
I'm gonna try this again. I probably have to refresh. Or this might be my one demo fail. Okay, it'll be my demo fail. I don't know what's happening with the course. I thought I fixed this earlier, but it's acting up on me. Anyway, if I fix that course policy, I will be able to call that same, just the way I tested in the portal, I can test directly from the developer portal as well. Pretty cool. So I know we're running low on time. Okay, I'm just gonna show you something cool and then we'll wrap it up because we're pretty much done, I believe.
One question from McKenna. Is there a way to restrict calling particular APIs based on role? How do I configure that?
Yes, potentially. So there's probably a few different ways to solve that problem. What you can do, and I didn't show it here, but there's this concept of groups within API management. And so you can expose certain APIs visibility to certain groups. And so you can make it so that in the developer portal, I don't even see that API for me to be able to use or subscribe to. So that's one way to solve the problem. There's other ways around OAuth, authorizations and things like that that you could leverage. So there's a few ways to solve the problem that you described. I didn't have it in the demo, but there's ways to solve that problem for sure. So I'm going to show you one more thing. So we spend a lot of time talking about REST APIs, which have very well-defined operations, right? Verb, resource, all of that is very well-defined. Well, there's something interesting that's coming out in the industry called GraphQL. And GraphQL is very interesting because it allows you to basically query an API. And so it allows you to select which fields you're interested in and only return the information you need. Super useful if you're developing, let's say, a mobile app, and I only need a subset of the information from my API, not everything. GraphQL is really cool. It's something we're making a lot of investments in. So I wanted to just quickly demonstrate that. So I'm going to test this GraphQL API. If you're familiar with Pokemon, this is a Pokemon GraphQL API. So I'm going to build a query based on this GraphQL, and I'm actually going to have to zoom out a little bit because it's a little hard to use this interface when it is zoomed in. So I'm just going to reload it so that I get the full interface. And I'm going to go ahead and test this. So I'm going to say get Pokemon is the first part that I'm interested in. And instead of Sylar, I'm interested in Charizard as my Pokemon, right? So I can essentially build out a query that says, okay, now that I've gotten a Charizard, let me look at how often, what the catch rate is for a Charizard. What kind of colors does it come in? What are its different evolutions? Let's see. Well, I have to pick something about evolutions. Maybe I won't choose evolutions because it's a little complicated. What's the gender breakdown for Charizards between male and female? What's the height of a Charizard? And okay, that's good enough. Or maybe weight. We'll pick weight as well. So that's some basic information about Charizard that I'm interested in learning about. You can see that I picked the different attributes of the resource that I wanted to learn about. I did not pick everything. I picked only certain things. Now, when I call my API, I get a response that only gives me back the things I'm interested in. So in this case, for my Charizard, the catch rate is, the base rate is 45%, and an ordinary Pokeball at full health is 11%. Oh, it's not very easy to catch a Charizard. The color of a Charizard is red. It's about 87% male and 12% female, 1.7 meters in height, and 90 kilograms in weight. So I can take a very large data set. You saw how many options I have. And I can make that schema available as part of GraphQL. And then I can pick and choose as a consumer or a developer which parts of that I'm interested in and only pull that into my app. But really interesting. So very different than a REST API, right? I did not say get, and I didn't give it a resource. That's all defined by my schema and my query that I built out. You can also do writes. So I just did a get, like a pull of information. If I wanted to write back into my database or write back into my API, I use something called a mutation. And I don't have an example because this is not a writable GraphQL API, but you would use something like a mutation. The other interesting thing you can do with GraphQL is you can subscribe to changes. So if I make a query that gets me some information, I can also set a subscription that says anytime that information changes, let me know that it's changed. So really powerful functionality. We have another feature coming out that's going to be super interesting called synthetic GraphQL. And the idea behind synthetic GraphQL is what I've got here requires a GraphQL server in the back end. Synthetic GraphQL is going to say, give me a bunch of REST APIs. Let me map my graph schema to those REST APIs. And so if I call for a certain attribute that's part of a REST API, then API management will make that call on my behalf, pull back the information it needs, and put that together and return a graph query to me, or graph response. So really interesting. It's in private preview. You could play with that a little bit.
McKenna asks, is federated GraphQL supported or still a work in progress?
Work in progress. So when you say federated GraphQL, you're talking about, can you clarify, McKenna, what you're asking?
Come off mute if you want, McKenna.
Yeah, basically multiple GraphQL endpoints consolidated into one endpoint so that then you can keep extending it.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it's a good question. I think you can do that in synthetic GraphQL, but I don't know offhand. So I haven't played with the synthetic GraphQL. In this case, what I'm doing is a GraphQL pass-through. So this just passes through to a backend that has a GraphQL server.
Yep. Thanks.
Yep. All right, that's my demos. I know I went over a little bit, but
Any other
Cool.
questions? Yeah, go ahead.
No,
Okay.
pretty good. I like it.
I kind of a high level
Typically
question
Yeah.
about enterprises that have adopted this or made the decision not to. What tend to be the friction points and maybe the gotchas that might make, oh, this maybe wouldn't work for us, but this would work for us? That's
well,
really
part of my job is to overcome some of those objections.
We were not sales guys.
We're not sales guys,
So
but yes. So a part of it is some organizations just aren't ready. Like there's a lot of momentum in this space, but some organizations just aren't ready to, because it is a cultural shift as well, right? Implementing an API management suite and building APIs, and a lot of the organizations we work with have been moving data back and forth through bulk data loads and file transfers and things like that for a very long time. And so it takes a cultural shift to move towards an API management suite or an API management strategy. So that is one of the things that we run into, is that some customers just aren't ready for that. Especially in the enterprise ready versions of this, it can be a very complicated configuration. A lot of networking, a lot of load balancing, a lot of multi-region. So that if it's an organization that doesn't have a lot of experience in Azure or doesn't have a lot of experience in deploying kind of these multi-region workloads, that's another challenge that I've seen customers face. In terms of whether or not there where this has failed or where we've had competitors, Some of it is related to other, so I've had a customer that chose not to go with API management because they had some very legacy authentication use cases that they needed to support, and it was more difficult to do that in this solution versus another solution. So some of it is circumstantial or circumstances based. But you know, some of the challenges are cultural, some of the challenges are maturity, you know, on cloud and cloud native. So yeah, I think that's some of the experience I've had.
And I know I asked you about resiliency a little bit before, but is it possible for, even if you're in multiple regions, for there to be a global outage such that this whole service comes down, your company loses all its APIs?
So
'Cause I know like Azure AD can have a global outage. And I
yeah,
know
so
there's
but
a backup-
Azure AD
I know there's
is
a backup service and how that works.
but Azure AD is a global service.
Right.
This is a regionally based service or multi-region service, right? So we say that 99.99 is the SLA if you are across either 2 regions or 2 availability zones in a single region.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I get this. I was interested also in the JWT authentication and how that works. I'm assuming that's just one of the tags you can put in there for how you set that up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it is a policy. So like, I don't have an example of it, but I can show you quickly what it might look like.
So rather than the subscription key, you just have that in its place, basically.
Yeah, and actually we would tell customers a lot of times, do both. Yeah, definitely. The subscription key is like the first line of defense, right?
Mm.
It's like the bare minimum you have to have to be able to call into the API. Then you can add layers on top of that. So let me show you what that might look like. So there's this validate JWT, and you can tell it what the header name is that you're going to pass the token in. You can tell it what to return, so 401 unauthorized if you don't pass in a proper header. You can say, you know, whatever error message you want to put in if it fails validation of the JWT. You can add required audiences, claims, and then usually you will pass in an OpenID Connect well-known endpoint. You can also do things like if you use symmetric signing of the key, you can pass a key in inline. If you use asymmetric signing, you can provide a certificate that it will use to validate the token. So you have some capabilities on how to validate and what to validate.
Okay, and that's not locked into Azure AD, it looks like.
Not
That's-
locked into Azure AD.
Any-
Use any OAuth provider you can validate against.
Which segues into a question Alexander had. Can we combine AD security with other types of security?
In what part?
Yeah.
So I will talk a little bit about the developer portal. So when I logged in to the developer portal, and I'll sign out real quick. When I logged into the developer portal, when I clicked sign in, I had an option to sign in with the username and password. Also had an opportunity to sign in with Azure Active Directory. It's because I turned this on my instance. So you can mix and match with the developer portal. You can mix and match different capabilities for signing in. It's a little bit limited. You can do Azure AD B2C, and you can do Azure AD. That's all you can do, plus the email username password. Those are the 3 options. That's the developer portal. In terms of logging into an API or providing authentication to an API, that can use OAuth, JWT tokens, and you can validate those tokens. So you can use basically any provider that you want, as long as you can validate the token.
And when a company were to transition to API management,
Mm-hmm.
I assume they'd want to lock down the actual endpoints that API management is now hitting. What does that transition process normally look like in your experience?
So if I want to harden,
Yeah, you want to harden
yeah.
it. Yeah.
So in enterprises, what we tell customers to do is make that API management instance completely private, internal VNet only. It can be exposed to your, your on-premise network if you've got connectivity, or it can stand alone. And then you reverse proxy any API requests through something like App Gateway. Or other solutions that do that same thing. We tell customers turn on web application firewalls, tell customers to turn on DDoS protection. And so if we're thinking about hardening, you leave that entire, you can also selectively route certain API requests. So for example, I have that API management that is only internal VNet, right?
Mhm.
I can say only expose APIs that have /ext in the URL. That don't have /ext in the URL, don't expose them externally. So that's something that we have an article that describes how to do this, but you do it with a combination of the App Gateway and API.
And then you secure the API management to the API as well, typically such that the API that you've got back there cannot be called directly.
Right, it's no longer public.
Lock it down, nothing can, only the API management can call it.
Yes. And you do use something like managed identity to authenticate to that API, or mutual TLS, and a bunch of different layers that you can put in place.
Okay, who just came from you? Question?
I thought it was part of the demonstration.
Yeah, the party has started.
About networking, you're saying.
Java is writing an API.
There we go.
There, sorry. Sorry, what was the question?
About networking, you're saying there's a lot of complexity and challenges with that. Are there any?
Well, it's not so much the challenges with networking, but the complexity comes when you talk about like multi-region, load balancing across the multiple regions, doing things like health checks across the multiple regions, those things being private networked, integrating those private networks with your on-premise network. All of those, there's a, especially when we're talking in terms of enterprise, a lot of those things are things that come into the conversation because that's what enterprises require.
Right.
And so that's where that's where that complication comes in, right? So it's not just networking, but it's how it integrates with all of your other networking. You have to think about it in terms of both, how do I get to API management, but how does API management get to my APIs? And where those APIs are. So some APIs are going to be on-prem. Some APIs might be in other clouds. And so then all of that adds complexity.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
All right, let's wrap it up. Thank you, Mitul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. Who learned something? I did.
Oh, yeah.
I do.
Yeah, that's good. I see some hands on the recording there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us virtually. I know some of you, I saw some of the chats, there's some of the folks here from Jules. So some folks from Mexico joined, Andrew from Australia joined. So hello from Houston. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Very cool,
Nice to
very
see
cool.
you all who've come out online. Thanks for your questions and interaction. Thanks again, Mitul, for speaking with us tonight. We'll be here again in this room in a month's time. We're going to have a data and AI, cognitive services, artificial intelligence type presentation is the topic. I hope to see some of you at that next month. Meanwhile, thanks all for coming out. Hope to see you all again.
Absolutely.
Thanks all.
Thanks.